This is Dr. Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 10 of season 6 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be talking with Dr. William Dembski about the new edition of the Design Inference. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. William Dembski. Dr. Dembski obtained his BA in psychology and MS in statistics and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. That's not all, however. Dr. Dembski has also received his Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Chicago, and he's done postdoctoral work in mathematics at MIT, in physics at the University of Chicago, and in computer science at Princeton University. Further, Dr. Dembski has taught at Northwestern University, the University of Notre Dame, the University of Dallas, and Southwestern Seminary. He's also held National Science Foundation graduate and postdoctoral fellowships. Dr. Dembski was previously an associate research professor in the Conceptual Foundations of Science at Baylor University, where he headed the first intelligent design think tank at a major research university, the Michael Polanyi Center. Dr. Dembski has published in peer-reviewed mathematics, engineering, biology, philosophy, and theology literature. He's edited several influential anthologies, including The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, Biological Information, New Perspectives, The Nature of Nature, Explaining the Role of Naturalism in Science, Uncommon Descent, Intellectuals Who Find Darwinism Unconvincing, and Debating Design, From Darwin to DNA. Dr. Dembski is the author and editor of more than 25 books like The Design of Life and Understanding Intelligent Design. And finally, Dr. Dembski is a founding and senior fellow with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture and a distinguished fellow with the Institute's Walter Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. And as mentioned in today's interview, we'll be covering the Design Inference, eliminating chance through small probabilities, where Dr. Dembski and Dr. Ewert examine the design argument in a post-Darwinian context and analyze the connections linking chance, probability, and intelligent causation. And now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Dembski. How was your day, and how are you doing?
It's been good. Thank you for that lovely introduction. That was quite a laundry list. Makes me think I have accomplished at least something with my life, so thank you. Yeah.
You're more than welcome, Dr. Dembski, and it is wonderful to see you on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly take a look at this week's current topic. Today's current topic will be a special one because we'll be launching right into your book, The Design Inference. With that being said, let's examine the thesis of your book. You wrote, "The central claim of this book is that design, as a logical category, when ascribed by successfully drawing a design inference, correlates reliably with design as a causal category. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's a signature, there's a signatory. Where there's a true sign, there's the thing signified by the sign. The design inference provides a reliable marker of design. Design inferences thus detect intelligent causes." So Dr. Dembski, may you please further explain the thesis of your book? Why exactly does a design inference provide a reliable marker of intelligent agency?
The first thing really to understand is that design inferences, insofar as they connect the logic with a causal account, is that they're effect to cause reasoning. So you see some pattern that has certain statistical and logical features, and then from there you infer to a cause that's responsible for that. Now, in a lot of contexts, we have a smoking gun. We see the agent actually in operation. So you don't need to draw a design inference. If you see somebody lying on the floor in a pool of blood, but you saw the gun, somebody shooting the gun at that person, there's no, was this natural causes? Was this foul play? Natural causes would be a chance-based explanation. Foul play would be a design explanation. So we don't worry about that when we've got a smoking gun. Question is, what happens when we don't have a smoking gun? If aliens were to come to Southwest South Dakota and see a rock formation that looks like Teddy Roosevelt, Abe Lincoln, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, what would they think? They would be inclined to think that this was a designed object, even if they knew nothing about U.S. history and U.S. presidents. So there are features there that they can look at and then draw a design conclusion. We do know, in fact, who created that. So there are pictures of Gutzon Berglund, who created this monument. But in the absence of that sort of causal account, is there enough to say that this is the product of design? And what is it about that tells us it's design? So that becomes the question. Is it just we have this intuition? It's just pure brute common sense. Oh, we know that that's design. Problem is, you can't really do science with that, because if it's just an intuition, sure looks designed to me. Where's the science? Where are the numbers? Where's the rigor in that? And so what I found as I was looking at this problem, and I actually came at this, it was through the study of randomness. I wrote an article which came out in the early 90s called Randomness by Design. It was written as a result of a conference that I attended in 1988, just as I was finishing my doctoral dissertation in math. Actually, I'd finished it and already defended it. And it was convened by Percy Diaconis and Harvey Friedman at Ohio State University. And it was on the nature of randomness. But the broad conclusion of the conference was that we know what randomness isn't. We don't know what it is. And the idea was randomness is always a provisional category until you see a pattern in the thing that seems to be random, and then it's no longer random. And there's an asymmetry. Once you see the pattern, you don't unsee it. So you may look at something that looks like an ink blot, and actually when you look at it more closely, suddenly you see it's a skull or a woman or something. And then once you see that pattern, oh, that's not the result of just a random ink blot. There's design there. And so that's what got me thinking. I ended up writing this paper, Randomness by Design, and then extending the ideas. Well, what are the patterns that we use in practice to identify intelligence? And what I found was you need two things. You need improbability, and you also need a certain type of pattern. And it has to be the right sort of pattern. So if you imagine shooting an arrow at a large wall, the arrowhead's very small, the wall is very, very large. It's going to be highly probable to hit the wall, and yet the exact location of the arrow on the wall is going to be highly improbable because the arrowhead is so small. Now imagine two situations. One, every time you shoot the arrow, you draw a target around the arrow so that the arrow is squarely in the bullseye. Okay, you do have a match between target and an improbable event, and yet that target was read off of the event. And so what you want that event to be independent of the pattern in some way. So what do we actually do to rule out that somebody is just shooting willy-nilly by chance at the wall? Well, we fix a target and then have the archer shoot at the wall. And if the archer keeps hitting the bullseye, then we ascribe that to skill, to design, and in fact, it becomes a matter of bad faith to say that the person just hit that target by chance. So you need the right sort of pattern, and you need improbability. You do need improbability because highly probable things happen. I mean, I can get out a coin, flip it 3 times, and I get 3 heads in a row. That's not going to be, did I get that intentionally? But if it's a probability of 1/8, it's so highly likely that it could happen. It doesn't matter if it was intended. It could be that I put 3 heads in a row intentionally on a desk. But if it's 1,000 heads in a row, or if it's 10,000 and in ASCII code or Unicode, it spells out the first lines of Shakespeare's Hamlet, then you're going to say, no, that couldn't be. So you need this improbability, but you also need the right sort of pattern. It turns out that sort of pattern we call a specification. And the way we characterize that, and in the first edition of the Design Inference, it was a little bit muddy. I had the right idea, but I also, I was trying to do too many things in it. But in the second edition, it's much clearer. It's basically having a short description length. That's what gives it to you. And the longer the description length, the more artificial or factitious the pattern becomes. And if you want a long description length, you need that much more improbability to counter it. So that's the idea. And I mean, the theory works. I mean, it certainly works in a lot of well-known human contexts. So for instance, we have a plagiarism case right now with Claudine Gay at the president of Harvard University. She's not saying that it's just by chance or independent writing that she came up with exactly the same passages as from other people. So, we use these design inferences with plagiarism cases. Another president of Stanford just recently resigned because he falsified data. It was basically the same type of graphs that he was getting from supposedly independent experiments. It would be highly improbable for that sort of a match to happen by chance. Much more reasonable explanation is that he cheated. And in fact, it's now being discovered that there was a whole pattern of his cheating. So these inferences are all over the place. In archaeology, is this an arrowhead? Is it a naturally formed rock? What tells us that we're dealing with an arrowhead? Well, there's going to be a lot of specificity there. It's going to be something that's functional in a way, and functional descriptions end up being short descriptions also. Broad in one of the cases I look at in the design inference is Bernie Madoff, the big Ponzi scheme, and there was a whistleblower, George Markopoulos. He was a quant. He looked at his data just for about 4 minutes and saw through that it was a fraud. And I do a rational reconstruction and I say, okay, what sort of improbabilities was he looking at? And he would have easily seen an improbability of on the order of, I think, like 1 in 50 billion or so. So this method comes up all over the place. Where it gets interesting, and the reason I don't have, at least this is my interpretation of it, a good academic job at this point, is that I took these ideas and applied them to biology. And that's what got me in trouble. So it's one thing to draw design inferences in human context. It's even reasonable to apply them in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or panspermia, directed panspermia theories, where life is seeded from outer space, but where it then could still be ascribed to some sort of ultimately natural cause. But if there is actual design in biological systems that cannot be reduced to purely materialistic forces, that was a bridge too far for many of my colleagues. And so that's why these ideas are as controversial as they are.
Thank you for expanding on the thesis of your book, Dr. Dembski. That brings me to my second question. Your book is subtitled Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities. This begs the question, how exactly does one eliminate chance? To quote from the book again, you wrote, "People throughout history have intuited what's within and beyond the reach of chance. The tools of modern probability theory, however, have allowed us to put numbers on that intuition, making it more precise." Dr. Dembski, can you further expand on this quote? How can we know that something is truly beyond the reach of chance?
Right. Well, what we do is, when you say truly beyond the reach of chance, usually these are contextually based arguments. So for instance, let's say you're a Visa card manufacturer. Visa or standard credit card has 16 digits. You also have a CVV code. You also have an expiration date. So it's probably about 20 decimal digits of information that you've got there. If you have people trying randomly to just generate a credit card, a valid credit card information, it's going to be improbable. I mean, if you imagine, 10, basically, if we're looking at about 10 to the 20 possibilities, that's going to be more than a million trillion. So if we can imagine, a trillion human beings, we don't have a trillion human beings, we have 8 billion. And if each of them could basically try to generate a billion or more credit card, I'm saying not just numbers, but the whole information. So the CVV and and usually you need even a zip code to generate all of that. The number of, this is what I call probabilistic resources, are so far beyond the situation that Visa and MasterCard and Discover, if somebody comes up with a valid credit card information, they're not going to say, oh, that was just randomly produced. Why? Because the possibilities are so many. Okay, they're going to draw a design inference. To your point about eliminating chance, this is, basically, what I'm doing is not something just that came, out of nothing. This is standard sort of statistical theory where we set up a rejection region, and if it's small enough, and we hit that rejection region, then we reject chance. I think this is standard R.A. Fisher significance testing. The thing is, I think the statistical community has never been clear what's small enough. So that's where I introduced this notion of probabilistic resources. We have to be clear on how many probabilistic resources there are. If you will, a probability is never small in itself. It's only small in relation to the opportunities you have to bring the event in question about. That's, I think, a key insight. And if there are not enough probabilistic resources and the probability is deemed small, then you eliminate chance. Now, eliminating chance is still not quite getting a design inference, because what that does is it just knocks down a given chance hypothesis. So we might say, for instance, let's say you see 100 heads in a row. That sure seems improbable, 1 in 10 to the 30 probability. So you've got 100 heads in a row. Then what happens? You're looking at this and saying, well, how could this have happened? What's the relevant probability distribution here? Because if it's just flipping a coin, that's independent, identically distributed random variables where it's uniform probability. But what if the coin was greatly skewed in the favor of, 0.999 heads? Well, in that case, you might see 100 heads in a row. Or what if it's a double-headed coin? So the question is, even though you've knocked down one probability distribution, it could be that there are other probability distributions that could be in play. So what you need to do for a full-fledged design inference is not just eliminate chance, you need to sweep the field clear of all the relevant chance hypotheses so that a design inference actually emerges. So that's the challenge. Design inference is more than just chance elimination. Chance elimination in standard statistical theory is knock down a given chance hypothesis. Design inference is sweep the field clear of the relevant ones. Now, there are different models of statistical rationality. What I'm going with largely is the Fisherians, R.A. Fisher's notion of statistical significance testing. There's another approach, which is Bayesian, and there's even a Jersey Neyman-Pearson approach, where the idea is that you never really knock down a given hypothesis. You always are trying to adjudicate among competing hypotheses. And so that's something we deal with also in the book. And I would say that the statistical significance testing approach is in the end more fundamental, but we can accommodate also the Bayesian approach. So that's the idea there. So it is eliminating chance through small probabilities. That's, as it were, the fundamental logical statistical technique that we use, but then it needs to be extended to get the full-fledged design inference.
I appreciate that you explained that, Dr. Dembski. So now that we know that it's possible to determine that something's beyond the reach of chance, let's see if it's possible to deductively determine that something truly was designed. In section 5.4 of your book, The Design Inference as a Deductive Argument, you outlined a four-premise deductive argument for the design inference. You wrote, thus, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. I would appreciate it if you could explain the four premises, what do they mean, and how do they result in a valid deductive argument for the design inference?
The logic of it in terms of this first order theory, it's okay. So we've got event has occurred, it's specified and has small probability. Okay, that's the second premise. Third premise is this law of small probability, that if something is specified and small probability, then it didn't happen by chance. And then the other is the dichotomy. It's either the result of chance or design. And then when you have those four premises, basically what you have is a disjunctive syllogism that works for you, and then design. There is a deductive argument there, but it depends on the premises being true. So if you don't, if you're wrong about the premises, then the argument, it's a valid argument, but the conclusion may not be warranted. In practice, when I do a design inference, I think of it, is it improbable? Is it specified? So is it, are the probabilistic resources such that when I factor them in, it's still a small probability? And does it have the right sort of pattern, this minimum short description length pattern? The logic of it is more of, I think, an artificial device to show, yes, there's a logic to it, but in practice, as a working statistician or as somebody just trying to figure out, does design apply? What you do is you use what I call this explanatory filter, which is basically, is it small probability? Is it specified? So there you go.
Dr. Dembski, it sounds like you're saying that the design inference can be grounded in deductive reasoning. Critics of the design inference would say that there's more to the picture, which is why for the next two questions we're going to be covering the NCSC review of the first edition of the design inference. Dr. Wesley Elsberry, an evolutionary scientist, said, Dembski's design inference fails to identify reliably phenomena due to design by an intelligent agent because of its logic, and because it fails to consider additional mechanisms, like natural selection, that could produce a designed effect. He proposed an alternative four-node explanatory filter to the design inference, which goes as follows. So Dr. Elsberry says, 1. First, an event that cannot be statistically distinguished from a random event is classified as due to chance. 2. Next, an event that conforms to properties of known law-like physical processes is classified as being due to regularity. 3. An event that conforms to known properties of similar events that are due to intelligent agents are classified as due to design. 4. Finally, any event which has not yet been classified is now classified as being due to an unknown cause. So Dr. Dembski, what do you think about his review of the design inference? Is Elsberry's explanatory filter a better explanation than the design inference?
No, and I think the problem with it is where he'll say it's something that's classified as similar to an intelligent cause. And he and most of the critics, what they do is they are wedded to a human inductive tradition, which basically says, if you're going to know that something is designed, you have to have past experience of designers creating things like that. Okay. And so that's why at his third node, he gets to intelligent design. If it's similar to something we know that's been designed, then it is. But who has seen God or a designer in biology actually arranging things, in a way where it's, inorganic chemistry came together and formed the first life or anything like that? So we have no experience of that. And so what he wants to say is, as a consequence, we just have to plead ignorance there. And then he's also going to want to say that that my filter, which in the earlier work had 3 nodes. I collapsed 2 of them because law-like regularity and randomness or chance, you can put those together because a law-like regularity, which produces things with probability 1, is an example of chance where the probability is then 0 or 1. But I think the real problem is this question of, do we have to have an experience of a designer creating something in order to then apply the design inference elsewhere? And I would suggest to you no. And I think that's true it's true because when you look at the nature of this Humean induction that's in the background. Okay, what is Humean induction? It's David Hume, and his idea was that induction works. We look at past experiences, and then on the basis of past experiences and similarities there, we project out into the future or to our present case and the experiences there. So I see somebody create an arrowhead, okay? And now there's this arrowhead. I see somebody else create an arrowhead. Now there's this arrowhead. Now I find an arrowhead in nature, okay? I conclude that it is designed, because I've seen designers create arrowheads. But the question is, how did I know that those designers were in fact designers when they were making those arrowheads? People whittle, they can do random stuff with their tools, or they can operate intentionally. So how did we know the difference? How did we know that those past designers were acting as designers in the first place? And the problem is you can't get that induction off the ground because we never can take that back far enough. And this is a point, actually, it's interesting. David Hume ended up publishing his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, where he made that argument, this Humean inductive argument against design. Came out in 1779, which was 3 years after his death. He published it posthumously because he thought it would just create too much of a furor. Thing is, his fellow Scotsman, Thomas Reid, took that argument on the year after it was published in 1780 in some lectures on natural theology, which I've republished actually. And that's where he makes precisely that point, that you can't get the induction. We don't know design by induction. It's not on the basis of past experience. It's rather that we are looking for marks of intelligence. He actually uses that very term. And what are those marks of intelligence? Well, for Reid, he was a common sense philosopher, and he thought it was something that basically was just built into us. Somebody, a philosopher like Alvin Plantinga, might say that this is our proper function, that when we see things that are designed, our minds are so adapted that we actually, so when we see design things, I should say, our minds are adapted to see that there is actual design there. So that's the sort of argument that he was making, Reid was making, and Alvin Plantinga. Where I would say I go beyond that is just saying, okay, well, what are the actual statistical and logical features of the things we're looking for in design? And it is specification, small probability. And, we have this experience that, that this is reliably correlated with intelligence. I mean, and just think about it. I mean, if we look inside the cell, okay, look at some DNA. People like Craig Venter, they've actually put their initials inside cell. They've got a synthetic genomics program in which they're going to manipulate the DNA. The DNA is basically a character convention. It's also code because it maps from one symbol convention to another. And we can tell that this symbol convention has been artificially manipulated by Craig Venter, okay, or by some human in this case. But if we can tell that a human has done this, why can't we tell that an intelligent agent generally has monkeyed with the genetic code and with the information in there? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a stretch one way or the other. It's the same sort of information, the same sort of technology that's being used. And, if no human was there to do it, then are we just going to say on what Wesley Elsberry's grounds, well, we've never seen a unembodied or unevolved intelligence invest DNA information. And so we're just going to have to plead ignorance. I mean, that just seems crazy to me. Let me just give you one other story before we move on. I was at a conference at MIT in 1999. I was speaking with an evolutionist named David Sloan Wilson. And I gave him this sort of example. And I said, imagine that we had something in a bacterium. We had something which I'll call a bacterial stinger that had CO2, and it would inflate other bacteria. It would sting them, inflate them with CO2, and blow them up, okay, and then eat their contents. I said, nothing like this has been found, but here it is. And imagine that some super genius biochemist created it, released it in the wild, but then removed all evidence of having had anything to do with it. I said, you would be then responsible, if as a hardcore Darwinist, you would have to say that, well, isn't it amazing what Darwinian selection was able to do? And he says, well, yeah, but that scientist would have been, or you're the product of natural selection. So that's how he dismissed it. It's like, so, so it was just like, you can't win, it was like, also to this other point with Wesley Elsberry, just to wrap that up, so he says, this approach doesn't actually take into account what natural selection can do. And I would say my actual explanatory filter, not the bastardized form of it that he gives, actually does work. It tells you, what potentially natural selection can do. But insofar as what you have to do is you have to actually figure out what the probabilities are associated with natural selection. And what he will want to say is, at the end of the day, natural selection raises the probabilities enough so that the design inference doesn't apply, which is exactly the point that Richard Dawkins made in one of his books called Climbing Mount Improbable. I mean, this all this ties together. This is a conversation where we've got people on opposite sides of the aisle on this, but climbing Mount Improbable, his point is that if you're going to evolve from one system to another, you have to get up Mount Improbable. That's a huge leap for chance. That would be highly improbable. And I mean, he himself will say your scientific theories can only allow themselves so much luck. But then he'll say, okay, how do you get up Mount Improbable? Well, you need to be able to take baby steps, small, a gradual serpentine path up the back way so you can get up to Mount Improbable. So basically, the whole point of natural selection then is to act as a probability amplifier so it can get around the design inference, okay? But I think even that's significant because it shows that the Darwinist is not actually setting the agenda. The design inference is setting the agenda, and they feel that they've got an answer to it. But that becomes an empirical question. Just how evolvable are these systems, and what are the sorts of improbabilities that they face? So, I've had some interactions with Wesley Elsberry. It was a long time ago. I always thought that it was a bit of a stunt that he was pulling. I never thought that he was actually dealing with the arguments head on and allowing for the challenges that the design inference posed to his theory. So that's I think that's where I'd like to leave the response.
Thank you for comparing Elsberry's explanatory filter and the design inference. Right now, we're going to continue going to the next major point in the NCSC review, which is Elsberry's contention that the design inference seems to beg the question. Elsberry writes, "The point is more significant than Dembski admits. A causal class cannot be classified into regularity or chance in advance without begging the question. Specifically, one cannot state in advance that natural selection is either regularity or chance because the events which are due to natural selection must be evaluated by their own properties to establish which category best describes those events. Just as intelligent agents can sometimes produce events which appear to be due to regularity or chance rather than design, so too can natural selection be responsible for events in all three categories. It's insufficient to show that some examples of natural selection fall into either the regularity or chance example categories. When arguing that no physical process is the agent producing a designed event, one must show that natural selection is incapable, in principle, of producing events with the attribute of design. Such a demonstration would have to address the application of natural selection in both biology and computer science, where use of the principle of natural selection has been employed in solving very difficult optimization problems. So, Dr. Dembski, how would you address this? Is it the case that the design inference begs the question?
This passage from Elsberry, I think it's really muddy, and I don't mean to be unkind, but I think first off, let's do a clarification, because I think he's responding to the explanatory filter as it was in the original edition of the design inference, which was there were 3 decision nodes in there, and the idea was the first thing you ask is the result of a regularity. Okay, in that case, ascribe it to necessity. Is it the result of something that's unspecified? Okay, then you can ascribe it to chance. Is it both specified and improbable? If not chance, otherwise design. So the thing is, though, you have these categories of necessity and chance as though they are mutually exclusive, and they're not. I mean, as I said earlier, necessity can be assimilated to chance by just collapsing all the probabilities to 0 and 1. If I flip a coin, two-headed coin, it will necessarily land heads. Let's assume that it doesn't land on its edge. Okay. Physical laws, they tend to be, it's things, I guess, other than quantum laws, but typically we think of physical laws, attraction or whatever. It just happens, it happens reliably over and over again. We don't think of there being probabilities associated with that. The thing is, we can get something like natural selection operating in an environment with heredity and some form of variation. This is also falls under chance in some broad sense. I mean, I'm a probabilist. Stochastic processes really account for, you can model anything in physics, anything in nature with a stochastic process. You can zero out the stochastic element and then you get something deterministic. But anything that's can be characterized by a stochastic process would fall under what I'm calling chance. So even natural selection falls under this. I think one of the things, Elsberry focuses on this explanatory filter that was in the first edition. There's a simplified form in the second edition, in the sense that we just collapse necessity into chance, and it's just all the filter now does is distinguish between chance and design. And I think what the explanatory filter, its whole point was to provide a rational reconstruction of how we do design inferences in practice. It says that we're a checklist. This is what we do. But I think it ended up being misleading, and I don't actually make much use of it anymore, because I think it gives the sense that a simplistic sense of what's really involved with the design inference. So this is, I think Elsberry, hence he did his own rendition of the design inference. And then I think he tries to do a little 2-step tap dance around natural selection, not really falling under this conception of chance that's there. And I would say it does. And so to his point about what can natural selection do in a biological, or you really don't have natural selection in a computer context, but you do have evolutionary computing scenarios where you've got something like a fitness landscape and then you're trying to optimize over it. But invariably, even in those cases, either you've set it up so that it, with high probability, it finds a target. And I know that people, they want to say, well, there really isn't a target in evolution, but in any evolutionary computing context, you're trying to optimize something. You may have a crooked wire genetic antenna or something else that you're optimizing. So you are trying to get to a target. And the question is, does it take you there reliably and quickly? And typically it does. That's what the software engineer is going to want to do, is going to want to solve the problem. So it gets you there with high probability. That's the whole point of it. But as it gets you there with high probability, you don't have a design inference for getting there, because now you don't have small probability anymore. On the other hand, what was it about that fitness landscape that got you there in the first place? Because, invariably with these evolutionary computing scenarios, you're putting a lot of design into the fitness, okay, or some other features of it, but the information is getting in there. So there would be lots of ways of adjusting the fitness. You're choosing one, so the improbability ends up actually being in the fitness. So you don't get around the design inference, but you can make it seem like it's disappeared. And I think that's what ends up happening in a lot of these situations. So you end up doing, it's a little shell game or so. You're trying to hide or trying to hide a pebble or something, but it's still there, and you've introduced it, and you've introduced the design, even though you're claiming there's no actual design there. So I think it's a ruse, but and I think this actually gets dealt with, I think, in good measure in the second edition of the Design Inference. And actually, it is worth expanding on this. So let me give you an example, or maybe a few examples. And I think your listeners may find this helpful. I was on a program with the NCSE, National Center for Science Education. One of my witty friends would call it the National Center for Selling Evolution. Anyway, I had to get that jibe in, because I was on the receiving end of so much of their barbs. But I was on a program with Peter Robinson at Stanford with Eugenie Scott, who was head of the National Center, NCSE at the time. This was about I think this was around 2000. And the whole trope about monkeys typing Shakespeare came up, and if you have enough monkeys and they're typewriters and they're randomly typing, will they produce Shakespeare? And Eugenie Scott's point was, well, that's not how evolution works. The way evolution works is you should think of a lab tech with a vat of whiteout behind the monkey, and every time the monkey types a wrong letter, the lab tech whites out the wrong letter, okay? And then you get Shakespeare that way. And indeed, that would get you Shakespeare much more quickly. But the question then that needs to be answered is, how did the lab tech know what to white out? I mean, if it's an error presupposes that you know the right way to do something, okay? So that's invariably the problem that comes up. It's that you're pushing the design elsewhere where somebody's going to say, where it doesn't seem quite as obvious. You find this in Richard Dawkins, and he thinks it is like a weasel example in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He evolves a target phrase, and he thinks it is like a weasel. It's taken from Shakespeare's Hamlet. I think it's 28 characters, and you allow 27 letters or spaces. And with just from a random string, if you just tried just randomly generating new strings every time, so basically think of it just as pulling a bunch of 28 Scrabble pieces, arranging them. Is this, he thinks it is like a weasel? No. Do it again. Okay. It's about a 1 in 10 to the 40 probability that you'll do it. But if you treat me thinks it is like a weasel as a target phrase, and then you reward variations that are closer to the target sequence, letter by letter, so with what information theorists would call a Hamming distance, then you can evolve there much more quickly. So waiting times or stopping times are related to probabilities. The shorter the waiting time, the more probable it is. So the actual average waiting time to get to, he thinks it is like a weasel with pure randomness, is 10 to the 40 steps on average. But I think for Dawkins' weasel example, once you had the target phrase and you were using fitness was measured in terms of proximity to that target sequence, you could get there in 40 to 50 steps. Okay, so you've reduced the waiting time dramatically, you've increased the probability. But why did you choose that fitness function? You could have chosen any number of fitness functions. What was it about that one that you chose? Well, obviously you chose it because it would evolve you there. But the point was to get Shakespeare, but now the point is to get the fitness function that gets you Shakespeare. And let me give you one third example, because I think it really makes the point, and it points up something. It's as it were an incompleteness in the design inference, because it's something we call conservation of information or displacement. So imagine you've got a huge field. There's an Easter egg hidden somewhere. The field is so large, the Easter egg is so small and well hidden that a random search is going to be highly, highly unlikely to find it. It's specified, that's if you find it, it's the Easter egg. Random search is not going to find it. Exhaustive search is not going to be possible. You just don't have enough time to try to find everything. So you go out on the field and somebody's shouting to you, warm, warmer, colder, warmer, warmer, hotter. You're burning up, and then you look down and there's the Easter egg. Now, what happened there? You're getting information that guided you to the Easter egg. But the question is, where did that information come that guided you to the Easter egg? And this is what the evolutionists, the Darwinian naturalists always do. They ignore that sort of prior information that gets you to the Easter egg. So it's as though, well, that's just a gift from, not from God, because as far as they're concerned, most of the time God doesn't even exist, but it's a gift from somewhere, but it is a gift. They, as it were, help themselves to that information. But you have to ask, where did that information come from? Well, obviously the person who was shouting warm, warmer, warmer knew where the egg was. But notice the problem got displaced. You were just there out on the field having to brute force it, but now you had to get the information from elsewhere, but that information itself needs to be accounted for. So where did that come from? And another way I would illustrate this is you have a map that gets you to the Easter egg, but that map, which is marked X, could have been marked X any number of other places. So you're, as it were, you're searching for the right map with the X, which will then help you find the Easter egg. But we call this the search for the search, which we abbreviate S for the number S. So what you've done is you've displaced the problem, but you've not eliminated it. Okay. And actually what we do with conservation of information, we've proved these results. I mean, there's a whole literature on this. If you go to the Evolutionary Informatics Lab, evoinfo.org, and look at the publications page. I mean, this is IEEE journals, standard engineering literature, where we prove that this problem of the search for the search at best keeps your search difficulty constant. That's why it's conservation of information. But in fact, in general, the problem just gets worse, because these search for the search spaces tend to actually get bigger, exponentially bigger. So what this means is that as you try to backtrack in time to account for information that you're seeing now, the problem has gotten worse. The improbabilities have gotten worse. And this is significant, because from an evolutionary vantage, what the evolutionist wants to say is that we can get complexity from simplicity. Richard Dawkins will say this is what makes evolution such a neat theory. I mean, it's the ultimate free lunch. You've got a world in chaos, and the order just emerges. Presto changeo, there it is. No need for any design. And what conservation of information shows is that actually the amount of information you get out, there have to be at least as much information put in. So that's conservation of information. It's a correlative result with design inference. Design inference says if the probability is small and specified, you've got design. Conservation of information says if you have something that eliminates the small probabilities, it's because there's prior infusion of improbability that's at least as bad. So you haven't gotten around it, but it's a different type of result. It has a different flavor. And so that's actually, we were going to fold that work on conservation of information into the second edition of the Design Inference, but the book got big as it was. It's almost 600 pages. So we decided to write a second book. And so that's coming up.
Thank you for addressing both of those objections, Dr. Dembski. Before we close, I wanted to touch on the utility of the design inference. For instance, in the epilogue of your book, you wrote, "Conservation of information is a natural continuation of the design inference. Conservation of information is an accounting tool for tracking information and making sure it's not illicitly smuggled in or siphoned off." So Dr. Dembski, along those lines, can you further explain how the design inference will enhance various fields of research?
I think the design inference is already part and parcel of many areas of human inquiry and research. I think many special sciences depend on it. It's implicit in archaeology. It's implicit in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So I don't think you can get around it. I think where it becomes significant is in biology, origin of life, subsequent evolution of life, cosmology, fine-tuning, areas like that, where I think it's going to make the scientists, or it's going to encourage the scientists to be honest about the specified complexity, these features of design that they find there, and not just sweep them under the rug, and not just get rid of them through some sort of rationalization, like we're living in a simulation, or we're one of an infinite number of universes. So this is just a selection effect, and we're just lucky lottery winners who happen to be around. I think it's healthy for science, to come to terms with the actual design that is there, and not just to be pushing for these hopeless and fruitless naturalistic solutions that give no sign of providing any legitimate insight. I think that's the problem. I mean, we don't reward perpetual motion machine makers, right? I mean, I understand that the patent office will not issue patents for perpetual motion machines. Now, the thing is, we've got the second law of thermodynamics working for us with perpetual motion machines, but I think what we haven't had is design inference technology, as it were, and conservation of information to keep biologists honest. I think that's been the problem. So they're, I think, like the perpetual motion machine makers, just spinning off these tales, and it seems to me they're on a hopeless quest. And now from their vantage, it's just we're giving up on science. You just get back in the lab and try to figure out how to make that perpetual motion machine. But at some point, you've got to come to a conclusion whether the task is hopeless, whether you should be looking at new areas. And this ties in actually right with Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. It's have we reached the end of the paradigm? Are there enough anomalies to justify jettisoning paradigm? And that becomes a judgment call. And I think from the ID perspective, yes, we have. And it's not just that the anomalies have accumulated, but we think we've got a better theory. We've got better theoretical insight into what's going on in biology. That's where we come down. And I think we've got the better argument. But, as that famous New Yorker cartoon said, you've got an attorney across from his client. He says, you've got a really good case, Mr. Pitkin. Now, how much justice can you afford? So that's the issue, right? I mean, it's we can have the better case, but when you've got people like Steven Pinker at Harvard and Richard Dawkins at Oxford, and controlling all these very nice cushy chairs at universities, and having all the students, and then being able to pressure people on the ID side. I mean, it's I just learned of one colleague. It looks like he got tenure, even though he was outspoken about his views on intelligent design. I'm obviously not going to say who that is, but that's a rare occurrence in the mainstream academy. If you've it's the usual advice that we give our colleagues is keep a very low profile until you get tenure. But in his case, he was more outspoken, and it looks as though he actually is getting it. So maybe that's a sign also of changing times. But it seems that there's been just a lot of pressure to keep these ideas at bay.
Dr. Dembski, we've now come to our final question. While the Discovery Institute is not a Christian ministry or organization, and the theory of intelligent design is not a Christian theory or theory that requires its proponents to be Christian, because I know that you are a Christian, I ask, how do you believe that we should love Christ with all of our mind?
That is the challenge. We can never love enough, right? When it's the true love, the self-giving love, and it's something that I certainly fall short in, and it's probably safe to say that all of us, except Christ Himself, have fallen short there. I would say, to your point about Discovery Institute, there are many Christians there, not exclusively. It seems to me that Christianity puts a premium on truth. Jesus will say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And there's so much lying that's going on. I think we appreciate it in the political world. We appreciate it with the medical travesties we've experienced the last few years. Insofar as we are speaking and uncovering the truth of design in nature, it seems that we are advancing truth. Now, the ultimate source of that design, I would say most of my colleagues, again, not exclusively, I think of David Berlinski and others who are not Christians, but most of us will see the design in nature as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian God. But, this is an old argument, actually, that from finite material processes and objects in nature, there's no way to reason back to an infinite, personal, transcendent creator God. It's, as it were, if you have a balance scale and the balance is down on one end and the other side is up, what do you know about what's down there? You know that it's heavier than what's up here, but you don't know how much heavier. And this was a point Immanuel Kant made, actually, in his first critique. He would say that the design argument legitimately gets you to an architect behind the world. So he was not dismissive of the design arguments, and I think we miss it also that he was looking at pure reason, but then he was also looking at practical reason. And from the vantage of practical reason, design thinking was something that you needed to have. But his point was that from an architect, you couldn't get to the source of being of the world as such. It's one thing to arrange things, make finite arrangements of things, but to go from there to an infinite source, infinite God, and then also someone who brings being into existence, right? I mean, there's that old joke about get your own dirt, right? Scientists go to God and say, we can do everything you can do. God says, show me. And they say, well, we take some dirt and they're going to arrange it into a living form. And then God says, get your own dirt. Where does the stuff, creation always goes further than design. Design is looking at arrangements of taking existing materials. They can be abstract materials such as letters, characters on a keyboard, but they can be actual material things like arrowheads. But design is about the arrangement of existing things. Creation goes deeper than that. And so the design inference, design arguments, intelligent design as a scientific research program can only take you so far. In my view, that's just being honest about the limitations of it. It's not trying to do everything. It's not the gospel. It's not telling you the good news about Jesus Christ. But I think where it helps the gospel is in clearing away so much of the rubbish that prevents people from seriously considering the gospel. You have somebody like Lee Strobel, who will describe how when he was exposed to the Miller-Urey experiment, in which inorganic chemicals were shown to be able to form some of the building blocks of life, he drew as a conclusion, it's easy for life to form without the need for a designer, and he lost any faith that he had. Now, when I was confronted actually with the same sort of evidence, for me it was, those building blocks, you still got to arrange them, and it's highly improbable. So for me, when I looked at chemical evolution early on, it was just utterly implausible. But the thing is, people draw these conclusions, and intelligent design, it seems, will hold people's feet to the fire and say, no, you can't just have this sort of facile dismissal of intelligence. You need to take seriously that these arrangements of parts that make up organisms at the nuts and bolts level, that there's no good argument that they've just self-organized or that natural selection is adequate for bringing them about. And so I think it's a way of holding the scientific community honest. And, I think that the scientific community is overwhelmingly materialistic. Even to this day, I probably could, if I wanted to ingratiate myself, I could just announce, hey, I'm a theistic evolutionist. I accept that Darwin got it right, and this is the way God did it. Now, Now, can I be part of your club? But I don't, it's not what I believe, and I'm not going to sell out that way. I mean, so.
Dr. Dembski, it was an absolute joy. Thank you very much for your time. And to our listeners, thank you for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Dembski's biographical information, his credentials, his books, and written works in the description. You'll also find links to his numerous technical papers, his website, and a link to purchase the second edition of the Design Inference, along with a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store in the description. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.